video that I found that was quite good. I do cut it off right before the Meiji period begins, but if you want to see the whole thing, just look up History of Japan. Oops, 1 second.
No sound.
No sound, that's not good. Let's see here. That may not work after all. This video, but you may not be able to either project it or have it here. There's no audio connector. Oh, gosh darn it. Well, okay then, new plan. So, this is basically this video, which I wish we had the chance to see. I'll have it going on in the background as it's going on, and they do have stuff. Well, pretty much what this talks about is so first the original age of Japan, of like back when there was land mass and how it became an island, and around this time, oh man, this probably won't work out too well. They're trying to narrate it as it goes, but pretty much what this does is this gives you this video, which I do highly recommend trying to find online, is pretty much what this does is this kind of gives you a basic idea of the history of Japan from from ancient times all the way up to modern age, actually. Though it does have some language in it, so I'd be wary. Don't send little kids to go watch this video. But one of the things it talks about like say the let's see, it goes over the basic eras of Japan. Though the immediate era that's of interest, right, that directly affects the Meiji period that most of you probably know about is the Edo period. This is the period where the Tokugawa family ruled the land. And what they did is they actually closed off the country and pretty much were, with the country, isolated only like with some very minor trading between the Dutch to get some information, technologies, but for the most part they're like, we are staying in this time frame of this period, or not time frame. We are isolated, we want nothing to do with those filthy foreigners out there. And when they became isolated, it became an interesting scenario where the nation was more, because of its isolation, its culture became more deeply rooted and it was less open, or I'm trying to get the right words. Sorry, normally I let the video play and explain all of this, so here I am attempting it. Now I'm giving you a little bit of an Edo period explanation in addition to the Meiji period. But the main thing to know is the land was very closed off. Nobody could go in, nobody could leave. If you tried to enter or leave Japan, the punishment was death. They would straight up kill you. And even if a foreigner landed there by accident or was shipwrecked, they'd also be put to death. So very isolated. They wanted nothing to do with the outside world. However, this was the time when not all nations, including America, were kind of in the let's explore new lands and ideally conquer them while we're at it. So around 1854, the black ships that were run by Commodore Perry, and this was one of the major military commanders. He shows up to Japan's shoreline and goes, all right, open up the country right now, or we will invade your land and force you to open up the country. And so it was not exactly the most diplomatic entrance, and they were like, oh wait, we don't want to open up the country, and Commodore Perry's like, too bad, open up. But they were able to convince him to give about a year for them to get their druthers together. Say, okay, well, I'll be back in a year. Unless you open up your borders and let us sign trade agreements and do other stuff, we will come in and conquer you, essentially. And because of Japan's isolation, they were not as privy to the more advanced technologies that were available to the Western world at this time. They did have guns in Japan, but it was more, but they were sort of more like old-style models that were popular, say, probably like in the late 1700s. This is the mid-1800s, so there's been a lot of advancements, and they didn't have any warships like that the Americans had. So it was not an empty threat. If the Americans wanted to come in and invade, they easily could. So during this time, during this period after Commodore Perry left, he was like, okay, we got a year to figure things out. Well, Commodore Perry changed his mind, showed up in about, I think it was 9 months later. He was like, yeah, I'm just kidding. He said a year, okay, a year. Come here, do it now, or we're going to invade. And seeing as I had no choice, the current shogun at the time, who was a direct descendant of the first Tokugawa, he pretty much was like, well, it's either this or be conquered. Okay, so we'll sign this trade deal, which was very unfair to the Japanese. This was pretty much it was almost equivalent of a surrender treaty without there even being a war. But pretty much it was like, hey, an American can go there, do essentially almost whatever they want with little to no consequences. I mean, like if an American showed up, murdered somebody, they wouldn't be tried in a Japanese court, they'd have to go back to America and be tried in an American court, where the American courts are like, it's no big deal. So this led to a lot of bad blood for a while. And after America decided to steamroll on in, so did several other nations, like France, like England, and a few other European was like, hey, let's get in on this great trade deal where we could essentially do what we want in this cool, interesting land. So this resulted in a lot of animosity and anger on the part of the Japanese. It led to this time period called the Bakumatsu, which is very hard to read up there, but it's there. Pretty much the way it was is because of these humiliating treaties, there became this sort of mantra that people were all behind, which was revere the emperor and expel the barbarians. So it's like, yes, let's get back to our roots and get rid of these lousy heathens who dare come in and desecrate our lands and do as they see fit. So pretty much it was decided in this time. Originally the shogun was in charge, but the emperor was more kind of a puppet of the shogun. But they decided to return all of the power to the emperor, the young Emperor Meiji, in 1868. And this resulted into an interesting thing because Meiji was only about a teenager at the time. I believe he was like 16 or so. So it was decided, this sounds like a, it's like, go ahead, we can sort of use him as a puppet, if you will. But power's technically in the emperor's hands, but after giving over power, the shogun kind of realized, this sucks. I don't like being in power. I like being in power. I don't want pretty much the people that are in charge of the emperor to rule around. I want to rule. So this resulted in something called the Boshin War, which is pretty much two sides, one that was more pro-shogun and the other side that was more pro-emperor, were duking it out in a really nasty fight. And it was an interesting time because both of them wanted the same thing, get rid of the foreigners. However, they were essentially fighting to the death of figuring out how to do it without really realizing, maybe if we join forces, we might just have a chance at getting rid of these foreigners. But in the end, the emperor's forces won out. So, so the emperor, the shogun family was completely kicked out. The samurai class, which was mostly what followed under the shogun, was almost completely abolished. There were a few still remnants left, but the samurai class was gotten rid of for the most part. And they soon realized that getting rid of these foreigners was not going to be easy. In fact, probably not possible at all. So they went for a new strategy, which was if you can't beat them, join them. Let's modernize our military, our strength, our forces, so that we can handle these foreigners if they try to take the battle to us, we'll fight them on equal terms. And thus what became revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, sort of shifted to enrich the country, strengthen the military. And as a result of this, we got a very interesting time where pretty much it was both a cooperation and competition with the Western powers, not just America, but Europe as well. And with the sort of, if you can't beat them, join them mentality, they decided, if we are the same military might, we will be treated equally among these nations. We don't want to be seen as lesser because they saw what happened when they are seen as lesser. All I had to do is see Europe and America's treatment of China to see what happened when they thought of lesser. Pretty much you get things like the Opium War, where people, they're like, we can dictate what you do because we have the military might to force you to. So that in order to be on equal footing with the Western nations, the Japanese decided to study what the Western nations were doing right in their eyes and adapt it to suit their country. So they sent out dignitaries in order to study the governments, the militaries, constitutions, technologies, and societies of all these different nations from America to Europe and all over the world. So they sent them over to say, and took the pieces that they liked best. So they took like the military from Germany, they took the police force from France, they adapted the Constitution from the United States. So they sort of picked and chose what they liked and became what they thought was ideal in order to be on equal footing with these countries. However, it wasn't all sunny and all in good times because there was a whole lot of inner turmoil going on around this time. For one thing, that samurai class has been mostly abolished. They were kind of pissed off because they had it pretty good during the shogunate, where they were as the military retainers, the knights of the feudal lords. But now the dynamic has shifted, and they're kind of just there, and now they're expected, to do like, well, you have to get regular jobs like with the merchants or the other lower classes, if you will. And this resulted in a couple of rebellions. One was the Saga Rebellion in 1874, and then the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877. And these rebellions, the first one was bad, but the second one was really bad. It pretty much wiped out thousands upon thousands of people. And some of them were not even former samurai, but people who idolized the samurai and wanted to be like them. So they pretty much went with one of the military commanders and went to Satsuma, which is up in the north, in order to fight again and establish what they see as their own government that was based with the shogun in charge. But the emperor's force was like, no, we have all of Japan. We're going to have that part too. So they came in, cleaned house, and lots of people lots of folks were killed in that struggle. This was then when the samurai class was completely abolished. We don't want any of those folks around here. And then what became established sort of in their stead was the oligarchy. And so the oligarchy is sort of the ruling by the upper classes, if you will. And we had what was established, instead of feudal lords with their samurai, we had the zaibatsu. And these are the mega corporations. They sort of became the new feudal lords that were in charge of what other people did, and they but instead of like employing peasants and samurai, they employed workers in order to build stuff for the economy. And the government actually worked directly with these zaibatsu to make it sort of so there was advantages to working with the zaibatsu. This wasn't like one of a more free market thing where it's like, oh, may the best company win, but more, this company will get a little bit of help for the government because it has the government's interests in mind. And actually, some zaibatsu that were set up during this time still exist to this day. Some of you names you may have heard of is Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Nissan. All of those were established around this time as the zaibatsu, and a lot of them are still around. And if you ever see like an organization chart of a zaibatsu, it's fascinating because they really are the lords of their area. One of the ones I saw, they owned a rail line, they owned a theater company, they owned a baseball team, they owned real estate. They didn't own just one thing, they owned everything with their brand on it. And so it was definitely an interesting shift of power during this time. One thing in interesting anime news around this time was a guy named Charles Rothman. This was a guy who formed what was known as Japan Punch. And what this is a magazine with a bunch of editorial cartoons and other sorts of political stuff. It was mainly aimed at English-speaking audiences, but it did get some popularity in Japan as well. And this sort of became the bedrock from which modern manga eventually started to come through. Yeah, and this guy actually, he was, I believe, British, and he actually decided to live in America, married a Japanese wife, and pretty much lived there to the end of his days. But he sort of established sort of the comics and magazine kind of thing that we see. So with now most of the rebellions quashed and overall things inner peace, kind of with air quotes there. I mean, there was still a lot of politics going on in certain types of inner turmoil. Pretty much the focus then became on industrialization of the nation and also of increasing what all great powers at this time had, a very strong military. Pretty much if you had the military, you could do whatever you wanted. And so Japan saw themselves as a world power and said wanted to compete with the Western nations. And what does the Western nations love to do at this time? Conquer stuff. You know, you're like, let's form our own empire, the British Empire. Even the United States was in on that action around this time. So pretty much it's one of those, okay, well, we want that. For several times they've tried to conquer Korea and failed. There's like, well, now we got the military power, let's do it. And Korea at this time was owned by China. So we had the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, which everybody thought, oh, China's so much bigger than Japan. They have such a longer history. China's gonna wipe the floor with Japan. However, that advanced military really worked on Japan's side. And they beat China and took Korea, which flabbergasted the West. You know, they were like, whoa, this was unexpected. And with this conquering, actually resulted in Japan getting into a beef with a different Western superpower, which was Russia. And because what ended up happening was Russia had made a deal with China in order so that in Korea that they could build a railroad there that was convenient. But now Japan owned Korea, so they're like, well, you can't take this land because we kind of already made out a deal. And Japan's like, well, we don't care, we own this land now. So with a lot of anger and some irritation going around, eventually war got declared. So Japan and Russia go to war. And this time the Europeans said, oh man, okay, well, Japan got lucky with China, but Russia, there's no way they can beat Russia. Russia's one of us. It's a Western superpower. But Japan won. Japan was actually able to beat Russia. Now, not necessarily conquer Russia, but defeat the military there and have it so that Russia was pretty much surrendered this area to Japan. And this really got the attention of the Western world because not only was Japan holding its own against China and conquering stuff now, it held its own against a world power. And then the treatment of Japan, I was like, okay, well now there's still, the others, they are still, like, oh, in that East Asian area, which a lot of the Western powers did definitely look down upon at that time, but they definitely treated it with much more respect than they would have otherwise, seeing that not only do they have the military prowess, but they also have similar ambitions as other Western nations. So, and in terms of, again, interesting anime and manga stuff going on around this time, there was a guy named Rakuten Kitazawa, who was a pretty interesting guy around this time. This guy was a comics artist, and he did comics and political cartoons. Now, the term manga had already existed before this time period. And most of you guys know about Hokusai, who's the guy who did that big wave picture that's what you see in every Japanese restaurant. It is pretty much, he coined the term manga to mean whimsical pictures. So like fun little illustrations that he would do. He called that manga. However, Rakuten Kitazawa, he decided to change the term so that it meant comics, or essentially comics. It's modern meaning that we see it today. So like when you say, I'm reading a manga, Rakuten Kitazawa was the guy who essentially made that happen. He was a big pioneer in getting doing comics and getting them in newspapers or magazines and that kind of thing. So that's roughly when the Meiji period roughly wraps up. So we're going to go a little bit into the Taisho period, which is the Taisho democracy from 1912 to 1926. A very short period of time. So what happened during this time was Meiji, the Emperor Meiji, he was a bit, he was kind of a rough and tough guy. However, he did have a lot of bad luck when it came to having sons. He had roughly 10 kids, and all of his sons died except one, which was Taisho. I think he had four daughters, and his 6 sons, or 5 of his 6 sons died, except for Taisho. And Taisho, he was what a lot of folks were saying, weak in the head or sick in the head. He was not well. He was an ill kind of guy, which is part of why his reign after Meiji died was only a little over 10 years. But the thing that was interesting during this time is we saw a big rise of what we call leftist ideas, like social welfare, workers' rights, not just, oh, we serve the government, and what we do is best for the government, strengthen the military, stuff like this. Well, what can we do as individuals to improve ourselves, to be as a better nation, to be more like a democracy, be a little bit more like the Americas and things like that. And then around this time was when World War I happened, and Japan decided to participate on the side of the United States and England and to declare war against Germany, because conveniently, Germany owned a few islands that they were next to. It's like, hey, we like those islands. Well, let's declare war on Germany and take those islands. And when the war was over, Japan actually got to sit with the other nations when the treaties were being written. So this was a huge status symbol for Japan. They were officially equals, and they got to keep their conquered land that they got from Germany. And during this time was really a short-lived prosperity. However, the Great Depression happened not too long afterwards, and this not only affected the United States, but the world, and it really hit Japan very hard. And what kind of gave, it sort of was the pathway that gave rise to the military government that sort of took over the country and led the country down to World War II. And that's roughly what happened in the time period, but one thing a lot of people are interested in is like, well, how has the Meiji period influenced anime and manga as we know it? Well, for one thing, like we said at the beginning, the school uniforms. Like they took the sailor uniform from the British, and the other uniforms from like Germany and Prussia. Another thing we saw was the rise of magazines. With technology there, the printing presses and stuff like that became revolutionized so that you could mass produce and mass print. So things like newspapers became popular, and as magazines like Japan Punch, which had the editorial cartoons like I mentioned before, but what's also interesting is Shonen and Shoujo Sekai, or Boys and Girls World. These were more kind of fun magazines that were aimed specifically at boys and girls of younger age ranges that kind of were almost the predecessors to Shonen and Shoujo Jump, or Shonen Jump and Shoujo Beat. And it's they had comics in them, they had stories in them, and it was sort of this magazines aimed at specific audiences that kind of started to rise at this time that really led to that sort of paved the way to the current state of manga that we see today. Another thing is we saw different types of storytelling. It wasn't just, oh, we're only telling the stories like of Japan, but it was like, okay, let's try stories set in these far-off worlds, like in their ideas, like, oh, of these interesting Western nations, or adapting Western stories. Like those were popular elements in like Shonen and Shoujo Sekai were Western, like Western stories that were at the time. Let's see, yeah, I mentioned the mass production of print, and one thing that I always find kind of interesting is before this time period, when it came to the public bathing in Japan, the sexes shared the bath. It was never men were separate and women were separate. Everybody shared it. It wasn't seen as fluid for men and women to bathe together. However, thanks to the Westerners like sticking our noses in going, what's men and women bathing together and naked? That's just cannot be. That's just not so. It was pretty much strictly because of the Western upset that they actually separated the baths, and now we get all of our infamous scenes of men or women trying to peek on the opposite sex in the bath. So that's roughly, again, some stuff, but let's talk about some anime and games that were set during the Meiji period, because oddly enough, the list isn't that extensive. Even though I think this is one of the most interesting time periods, there isn't a whole lot of anime or games set during this time. The one thing I want to make clear is this isn't a comprehensive list, and I am always, like, if you know something, mainly specifically knowing anime and games, just because if I included manga, it's one of those, there's a huge list of that, and that's tough to say. But if you know any that you don't see on the list, feel free to let me know either after or during the Q&A. So the most famous one, as most people know about, is Rurouni Kenshin. And this is set during the very early Meiji period. It's a story of a wandering samurai assassin from the Bakumatsu period, that era where the shogun's men and the emperor's men were fighting. And but after that time, he decides he has had his way of being an assassin, vows not to take any more lives. The show definitely showcases a lot of the influence, or the interior and exterior conflicts that were going around during the early Meiji period, and the rapid industrialization. And not only the rapid industrialization, but also some of the internal conflicts of like, how much do we lose ourselves by adapting to these strange Western ways? And one thing that I've always found very interesting with anime set during this time period is the later the show is set during whether it's the Bakumatsu, the early Meiji period, the later Meiji period, the early Taisho, the later it's set, almost the more pro-Western, pro-new ideas, pro-new technologies it becomes. If you do one set during the Bakumatsu, which I'll talk about at the end, they're very, oh, those Westerners they're just ruining everything. They're destroying the ways of it. You'll often see main characters dressed in the bright blue coats of a group called the Shinsen Yumi around that in anime set in that time. They're ruining it. They're destroying everything. But later on, they start like, well, they're causing a lot of conflict, but they may have some interesting ideas. All the way down to sort of the more modern ones set later, which are like, yeah, let's go use these Western technologies and defeat those evil, in order to defeat evil. Another anime set during the early Meiji period is Laughing Under the Clouds. This one I haven't seen a whole lot of, but it's set in the early Meiji period. But it's a supernatural series about like 3 brothers responsible for transporting criminals to a prison in Lake Biwa. And the interesting thing about this one is that a lot of the criminals and prisoners that they're transporting in this area are the samurai that were rebelling in the Saga and Satsuma rebellions I mentioned earlier. These were the ones that wanted that old way of life back, but decided to rebel and go up there, but were defeated by the Emperor's forces. So it has, even though this is a supernatural series, it does take influence from very real life events. This one's a little bit of a cheap cook, Gintama. This one is technically set in the late Edo period, technically not the Meiji period. But yeah, and the main story is, if you don't know, it follows a freelancer as he travels this world where aliens have invaded. Now, while this technically is not set during the Meiji period, one thing you'll notice is there are a lot of Meiji aesthetics in there. The Shinsen Yumi characters, like, if you notice, they're not wearing like the bright blue uniforms that they were in when they wore in real life. They're wearing these very westernized style, military uniforms, which they never did in real life, but it's definitely that have much more of a Meiji aesthetic to them. And you could also do some interesting parallels of aliens invading and America coming in and forcing them to open their borders. There's definitely a bit of parallelism there going. Another one that I personally like is the Otome Yokai Zakuro. This one's set during the late Meiji period and the early Taisho. It's sort of an alternative history. And the basic story is the story of humans and half-spirits in the government, in a government organization called Spirit Affairs that investigates supernatural problems. And there's a lot of technology versus tradition conflict in here, but you definitely get more of a pro-Western feel, as I said, the later it gets. Like, like all our 3 heroines, and they're very attractive, significant others. You'll notice, they may be more representing the spiritual, the more traditional Japanese roots, but it shows that they're willing to work with folks that are much more modern and militaristic. And a lot of it's also learning to adapt, not just, the Western ways are right or the Japanese ways are right. It's more trying to learn from them and figure out, okay, well, how can we make this work together? And then, the last anime I'll be talking about is Sakura Wars, which actually is both an anime, a video game, and a whole other matter of media. And this is in the late Taisho period, so actually the early 1920s. But one I like talking about is one of my personal favorites. So this is a steampunk alternative history of a performing musical group of ladies who pilot steam armor in order to fight demons. And the thing is, in order to protect Tokyo. And with this one fully embraces Western technologies. As I said before, and it's not like there is no conflict in this one. There's never like, oh, are we losing parts of ourselves by using this strange Western armor? No, not at all. It's one of those, yeah, let's use this Western armor, kill the demons, and save the land. It's that internal conflict, or that not really internal, that conflict of East versus West is definitely nowhere near as present in this one as you would see in items that are in shows that are much earlier in the Meiji period. So in going into video games, a few games that are of interest. One is Way of the Samurai, both game number 1 and game number 4. They're both set during the early Meiji period. And in the first game, it takes place during the Satsuma Rebellion, which it brings that one up again. It was a very important rebellion. And pretty much in this game, you get to choose which side you are supporting. And you get to see the struggle between the pro and anti-government forces. And the fourth game actually takes place right before the shogunate falls, so around the Bakumatsu period. And again, you get to choose sides, whether you're with the anti-government rebels, which are more the pro-shogunate, the pro-government forces, which are the ones for the emperor, or the British Navy. If you're just like, forget those Japanese folks, I'm going to go with those guys instead, with the Western folks. Another game from the United States is the expansion pack Total War Shogun 2, Fall of the Samurai. This one's also set during the early Meiji period, and like before, you can choose which side you want to be on, whether it's the imperial forces, the shogunate, or if you want a challenge, you can form your own republic and have all the sides go up against you. And for another game that's not directly set in Japan, but also kind of covers it, is something called An Empire Under the Sun, Victoria. And this one game is set during the Meiji period, and this one is actually not really about fighting or other stuff, but it's about internal management. So pretty much like, well, how would you run a country? And this is sort of what this game is sort of about. And pretty much about managing resources, industrialization, diplomacy, warfare. And Japan is one of the many locations in this game. It's called Victoria, so the primary heart of it is England. But Japan is one of the areas that's kind of, of interest in this game. Another game that's pretty new that I recently found was called 80 Days. And this is a steampunk version of Around the World in 80 Days, where you get to chart, you are Passepartout, which is Phineas Fogg's loyal servant, and you get to plot which course you want to take to circle the world in 80 days. And among one of the areas you can choose to go to is Japan, and it's one that you can visit while you're charting your journey around the world. And while this is more of a fictional storytelling of this time period, it does mention some of the real-world relationships and inner conflicts that Japan was having with the rest of the world if you visit the Yokohama area, which is the main area you visit, the main port in Japan. So going over some games that are actually set in Japan, from Japan set in this time period, here are a couple of visual novels, or dating simulators mostly. And they're both aimed at women, but this one, first one is Meiji Tokyo Renka. And both these are Japanese, so if you either know Japanese or can find a translation, you can play them, but yeah, guys, it's one of those. I'm more mentioning just, because to show that it's not just that, to show that there are some other games out there. This one, in the Meiji Tokyo Renka, our heroine who's from the modern era, time travels back to the Meiji period, and you get to date real-life historical figures. They are nowhere near as attractive as they appear on the cover. Again, they're... but it's more kind of a fun romp, but the people who they talk about and like the jobs that they do, while they may not look right, are real. I mean, like they do talk about like one of the folks who dates like a famous actor at the time, or a famous policeman. Like these are all very real people that existed. Again, they didn't look like the anime characters, but they were quite real. Another one that's a little darker is Chosu no Doku Hana no Kusari, which roughly translates to Flower Chain and the Poisonous Butterfly. And again, this one is set during the Taisho era, so a little after the Meiji period. And this is about a wealthy heiress who pretty much has to decide, who needs to get married and has to decide which man she wants to go with. This one is Japanese only, as is the first one. Now this one, which is the one on the left, that one is much darker. It is 18 up, 18 and up, so it can be a little naughty, and but it does show a lot of the aesthetics at the time. And another one, Dai Dakuten Saigon. This one is, this is a sort of, I'm mainly including it just because it's set during the right time. This is a game that's actually mostly set in Victorian London, not in Meiji Japan. But the very first, in this game, he plays a lawyer, essentially, this was a time where lawyers were kind of just starting and out in Japan. There really wasn't a regular lawyer legal system in Japan, not like we see today. But pretty much what this is it goes over sort of a lot of interesting East versus West tensions going on. The main character is one of those dignitaries that is sent to another nation to study what they see as sort of useful information. So they are studying the court systems of England. I think they actually adapted it from a different nation later on, but they did study all these nations. So, and there is some sort of real life stuff there. I mean, granted, it's not a realistic story. I mean, Sherlock Holmes is a character in there, so it's not exactly totally based in reality. But it's an interesting way to see, like, oh, this is a Japanese character from the Meiji era studying and being around in Victorian England. You can sort of see how, like, people of that time maybe saw the Japanese in their eyes, like from a different nation's perspective. And this is also, unfortunately, a Japanese-only game. So those are main ones set in the Meiji period. period. But let's talk also a little about the Bakumatsu period. This is that really period of rough transition where there was infighting between the pro-shogunate forces and the pro-emperor forces. And chances are, if you see somebody in that blue Shinsengumi coat, it's probably a Bakumatsu anime. And you can see some of them on here, like Peacemaker, Kurogane, Hachioki, Kazekaro, and a couple of others. So for most parts of these, when I was mentioning before about how, like, oh, the Westerns are great, or the Westerns are not so great, this one is definitely for most of these, it's like, yeah, those Westerners really aren't that good. But this is before the Meiji period even begins. They're just causing trouble, causing chaos, causing mayhem. So with one exception, down at the bottom is Bakumatsu Rock, which is, as I learned at the very start, this is an anime, a slash video game, that's pretty much set that's weirdly actually not, it is actually anti-shogun and anti-Shinsengumi. Pretty much our heroes need to use the power of rock and roll in order to free the nation from the tyrannical forces of the shogun and the Shinsengumi, which said, that's not a wild concept for Japan, but set during this time frame, it's very unusual to see an anime that's sort of specifically anti-shogun and more pro-emperor, pro-western types of things. And when I say pro-emperor and like pro-shogun, I don't necessarily mean the people who are pro-shogun are anti-emperor. In their minds, they are serving the emperor best by serving the shogun. So there was never oh yeah, we need to take down the emperor. That was not something that was a common mindset in this time frame. And if you wish to find out more on doing your own research, if you can get to Japan, again, I do highly recommend the Meiji Museum. Another one is the internet. The internet is your friend. Another thing is if you wish to find books on the matter. It's actually really hard to find good books about this time frame because it's sort of a kind of off-the-wall time frame. A lot of them are talking about the Edo period or the Warring States period. Those are much more, had a lot of chaos and conflict and were nice and far away. But if you live near a college, chances are you can find the library there. There you're much more likely to find specific research that's done about certain time periods. There's also, if you don't mind reading books written very early on, these are public domain books actually. One is Japanese Girls and Women by Alison Bacon. So this was a book written during this time. This was written during the Meiji period. And what this woman does is she decides to travel to Japan, and she specifically to study what the life of a woman was like from birth, to young age to through puberty, and then adulthood, and then death, kind of pretty much studying that. However, even though this is called Girls and Women of Old Japan, it's not specifically like we don't talk at all about that. What men do. A lot of the things that it is written from a female perspective, but it does have a lot of good information that affects all the sexes during this time. Another one that was also written this time by a different woman was Unbeaten Tracks in Japan. This one's much less focused on this is an interesting story or stuff like that. This is pretty much this woman decided to travel to Japan, and she pretty much did it for her health because that was a common treatment. Like if you were feeling sickly, just travel the world because that'll make you feel better. Or sometimes they say, oh, you can get better air in other areas. And what this book is actually a series of letters that this woman wrote to her sister, kind of saying, oh, these are some interesting things that I saw. These are interesting people that I met. And she was quite a trailblazer because she was actually, in some areas, she was the first Westerner to visit some villages and described about how some people ran from her screaming because they'd never seen a woman that looked like her before. And then lastly, if you're really into historical, detail and accuracy, is History of the Japanese People, which is by F. Binkley and Dairoku Kikuchi. And this is pretty much a history in that this family did this, which reflected to that, which related to that, which took a lot of details of less of daily life of what people were like, but more about what things were like, and more about this was the overall history. This family affected this in some way. It's a little bit tougher read, but there are people that prefer to know all this type of details. This is definitely the book for you. And before we get to the Q&A, I just want to give a quick spiel about the book that I'm writing that I hope that you might be interested in checking out since you're interested in Victorian Japan. And pretty much this is a story that is set during the Meiji period, actually right after the Satsuma Rebellion. That rebellion just keeps coming up. Pretty much it's set in Victorian Japan and stars a samurai cowboy who decides to return to Japan after 15 years of exile. If you wish to find out a little bit more about that, I actually have these little information cards right next to the sign-up sheet. You are welcome to take one. And if you sign up for the email, in addition to sending you this, I'll send you also like a quick link to find out more about the book as well. It is actually available for pre-order if you're interested in it in this time period, and it'll be for 99 cents. And it will be officially released on May 19th, which will still be 99 cents for the first week, but then after that it'll go up to $3.99. And that is pretty much my spiel about that. Do I have any questions? Yes? Did Japan try to expand beyond just like the islands that Germany owned and Korea? Yes, they pretty much went for whatever they got. They started expanding out. I don't remember exactly how much, but if you like look up like World War II stuff and like the Americans versus the Japanese, like they fought in the Philippines, they fought stuff like, they were steadily expanding as far out as they could go. They were trying to conquer China eventually during World War II, so they kept on going, grabbing as much as they got. For which exact areas they got, I'm afraid I don't know off the top of my head, but I'll definitely look it up. And if you wish to find, you can email me or something, or sign up for the email list, and I can send you that information later. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, as I said before, if you wish to get the copy of the presentation, please sign up right there. You're welcome to take an information card, and thank you very much for coming. And sorry the video didn't work, but hope you guys enjoy the rest of the con.